Distinguished guests, Honourable Christopher Pine, Honourable Jay Weatherall, Honourable Eric Neil, Professor Martin, ladies and gentlemen, thank you this morning for inviting me to share my views on a very topical Australian defence sector. And just to prove that I was actually listening to Michael's presentation there, I would just say that on the slide which was portraying the economic shift, it takes an engineer to point to an economist, why build two roads when one would have done? This morning, I have two key messages. The first is the critical importance of a unified objective that preserves the strategic defence capability of our nation. Very topical at the moment. The second is the need for Australia to preserve and indeed develop a sovereign capability that allows us to be self-sufficient in times of need. And let me just start by setting the context for those messages by briefly articulating how dynamic the geopolitical environment is today. This week, we saw worldwide media headlines about the growing defensive posture in China, in the South China Seas, with the Paracel Islands now allegedly protected by surface-to-air missiles. That same day, Typhoon jets were scrambled from RAF Coningsby in Britain to escort two Russian bombers headed towards UK airspace with an alleged nuclear arsenal. The 15th such incursion since the start of this year, and perhaps the latest in a growing provocation posture by President Putin. Yet 12 months ago, the geopolitical debate was focused on a strategic shift from the Atlantic theatre to the Pacific theatre. How quickly that view has changed. There remains significant unfinished business in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now a growing crisis in Syria. European nations are creaking under a migrant influx on top of an already very weak and shaky economy. So closer to home, discussions have centred around the need to protect our future revenues in the resources sector, and indeed Michael alluded to the impact of the oil price has had on our economy. And yet, the very same week, when the Saudis and Russia agreed a production deal, the oil price continued to fall to $29 a barrel. I suspect there's another angle of this debate still to be had. My point is that to properly consider our future defence industry, it's critical to understand the events that have the potential to shape it. It's also important to recognise that we have a national defence posture that requires an increasingly national enterprise. It's not just the role of government, but a collaborative approach that incorporates the defence industry, education, and academia. It's sometimes easy for us to overlook the benefits that flow from decision-making that takes place collaboratively at a national level. Instead, we often opt to see these from our own perspective. Examples of this include decades of statements by federal governments of both political persuasion that the submarine will remain a core strategic defence capability. These announcements followed 2 decades of proactive government policy encouraging private sector investment in maritime shipbuilding and defence. This private sector growth in the defence industry has reshaped the Australian defence sector landscape to a point today where it's unrecognisable compared to 20 years ago. Today, nearly every state and territory in Australia can claim a multinational defence corporate. And every one of these states, each of these companies are competing for contracts offered by just one customer, at a time where we can still not truly claim to compete in the export market. These are trends that show we're going in the right direction, that we are starting to focus outward rather than the programs that make the defence capability plan. But sometimes, together, government, industry and other organisations must and should reverse these short-term decisions. So given my opening remarks with regards to the dynamic geopolitical environment, I think it's imperative that we recognise the duality of our challenge if we're to logically and methodologically develop our own capabilities right here in Australia. The time required for us to mature our own capabilities will require us to rely on strategic partner nations who can provide us with the benefits of interoperability and thus shortening our transition to becoming a mature designer, builder, and operator of complex warfighting platforms. Let me turn closer to home and share some of my personal optimism for the future. In my 5 years working and living in Australia, I've naturally drawn some conclusions, comparisons with my time and experience in the defence sector in the UK and the US. My early days were filled with a sense of confusion. I saw a defence industry and enterprise that was very capable. I saw fantastic investment in world-class infrastructure that I hadn't seen anywhere else. A budget that was planned and capable of serving a strategic need. And now operational theatre experience that was producing real leadership benefits in the defence environment. But on the other hand, I also saw a bureaucratic system that was designed to slow progress. I saw a procurement process that was designed for a commoditised market. And I saw a political system that had become disengaged with industry. So as the chief executive of a major defence services company, it was like someone had given me the most complex 1 million piece jigsaw and someone was holding the box lid. Yet today, I think we've got much to be optimistic about. The defence sector, our sector, my sector, is now at a very important transition point. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, we can say we are clear on what we believe the challenges are for the Australian warfighter. Government has agreed to lay the necessary foundations for an integrated national strategy for defence. Defence Minister Payne is personally leading the charge to ensure the Defence White Paper reflects a cohesive view from defence industry. Not only does this give me optimism because I feel involved and am involved, but it's allowed me to see for the very first time in my 5 years here the integrative nature of the key people who can affect the defence sector now working across government, across political divides to achieve important outcomes. For example, it's no coincidence that Minister Pine is here today as the Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, because his department is fundamental to the success of the defence strategy. It's his department that will understand the long-term developmental nature of that strategy and its support for industry. The Minister has the key to successfully lead and develop the long-term outcomes that underpin our industry in Australia today. It's tomorrow's children who become our engineers that we have to start planning for. So my view is it's not time for isolationist tactics. We should set aside the politics of the day, seize the opportunity for us to build an industrial sector that leads innovation and technology, that fills our schools and universities with engineering, science and technology students of tomorrow. Building our submarines and surface ships right here in Australia is a fundamental start. Learning to integrate complex platforms, such as Joint Strike Fighter, amphibious assault ships, are also necessary for us to sustain our systems engineers. But we must be preparing now to grow our own design capability so that we can operate independently should we need to do so. And the changing and rapidly changing geopolitical environment is teaching us that we have to have our own resilience built within our own capability. It's also important to take those steps towards building complex platforms that we feel assured as a nation that we have the capability to achieve our goals. That means analysing the work conducted by thousands of Australians to deliver platforms such as the Collins fleet, the Anzac fleet, Super Hornets, multi-operational campaigns, Wedgetail and AWD. Yep, they were all complex. They were all difficult. They all created headlines and they all encountered issues. Show me a defence programme that doesn't have those headlines. These are some of the very best platforms in theatre right now. And have suffered at the hands of the Australian media in terms of the times of need and stress. My view is that these programmes and the people who invested their time and effort did not receive the acknowledgement to the degree that they should have. If I have a message for the Commonwealth, to the state governments competing for defence contracts large and small, is that, in my opinion, our nation has the necessary commitment and experience to deliver successful projects. We all understand the strategic imperative, and we're all collaborating to make sure that our national security is assured. It's time for us to sit together and collaborate. We have one of the broadest and deepest defence industrial bases in the modern world, right here in Australia, right here in South Australia. It's time to make some decisions. It's a very interesting and exciting time to be a nuclear engineer with a submarine background here in Australia, given the media this week. Thank you very much.